네, 저희 이사장님께서 이제 자리해 주셨고요. 그러면 지금부터 저희 41회 개발협력포럼을 시작하도록 하겠습니다. 안녕하십니까. 오늘 포럼의 사회를 맡은 코이카 어디 연구정보센터 김수진 연구원입니다. 이게 이렇게 추운 날씨에도 불구하고 저희 18년도 마지막 포럼에 이렇게 참석을 위해서 자리해 주셔서 너무 감사드립니다. 저희 이번 포럼은 사실 저희 코이카 개발협력 포럼을 참석해 보신 분들은 아시겠지만 기존과는 다르게 이번에는 저희가 외부에서 호텔에서 이렇게 진행을 하게 되었는데요. 이번 회차는 저희 코이카뿐만 아니라 UNDP DR 콩고 사무소와 함께 공동 주최로 진행이 되고 있습니다. 오늘 저희 주제와 관련해서 좀 더 풍성한 논의가 되지 않을까 싶은데요. 많은 집중 관심 부탁드리겠습니다. SDG가 채택된 이후에 특히 올해는 피스 관련돼 가지고 논의가 많이 되고 있습니다. 여러분들께서도 많은 자리에서 이미 보셨을 텐데요. 그간에 1년 동안 진행되었던 피스 논의 관련해서 올해 이번 자리에서는 평화지속화라고 많이 들어보셨을 거예요. 기존에 논의가 되고 있던 평화 관련된 가장 최신의 지금 이슈가 평화지속화고, 이거에 대해서 논의뿐만 아니라 이게 사업단에서 어떻게 이게 또 실현될 수 있을지에 대해서 종합적으로 살펴보는 자리로 만들고자 합니다. 오늘의 포럼은 기존과 다르게 4시간으로 구성되어 있습니다. 오늘 포럼의 주제는 평화지속화를 위한 포용적 글로벌 파트너십이고요. 오늘 포럼은 코이카 이미경 이사장님의 개회사와 UNDP DR 콩고 사무소 로렌 루다싱화 부대표님의 촉사를 시작으로 하고요. 총 4명의 연사분의 발표를 들은 후 토론으로 진행하겠습니다. 먼저 코이카 이미경 이사장님의 개회사가 있으시겠습니다. 큰 박수로 맞아주시기 바랍니다.
높은 자리, 높아졌네요. 네, 안녕하세요. 반갑습니다. 오늘 모두 다 연말에 바쁘신데도 불구하고 평화지속화를 위한 포용적 글로벌 파트너십이라는 이 주제로 참석해 주신 여러분들 감사합니다. 그리고 사실 평화라는 주제는 매우 가까우면서 어떤 때는 또 매우 추상적인 그러한 주제고 좀 어렵다 뭐 이런 생각을 가질 수 있는 그런 주제이기도 합니다. 근데 이런 주제에 대해서 여러분들 특별히 관심 가지시고 또 오신 것에 대해서 다시 한번 여러분들이 대단하신 분들이 아닐까 이렇게 생각을 해봅니다. 특히 이번 포럼의 공동 주최자로서 UNDP 콩고 민주공화국 사무소가 함께 해주신 데 대해서 특별한 의미를 가지고 있습니다. 감사드립니다. 그리고 오늘 포럼에서 축사 말씀도 함께 해주실 로렌 루디싱왕 UNDP 콩고 민주공화국 사무소 부대표님 비롯해서 데이비드 스티븐 뉴욕대학교 국제협력센터 부센터장님, 그리고 마가렛 윌리엄스 UN 협회세계연맹 평화안보선임 담당관님, 그리고 권구순 서울사이버대학교 교수님, 그리고 이번 회의에 토론을 위해 참석해 주신 모든 분들께 정말 이 자리를 빛내주셔서 감사하다는 말씀 다시 드립니다. 오늘 이 포럼에서는 정말 세계 곳곳에서 아직도 분쟁이 일어나고 있고 많은 사람들이 고통을 받고 있습니다. 이 분쟁 위기를 해소하고 또 분쟁을 사전 예방을 통해서 어떻게 인간의 안전한 삶을 보장할 수 있도록 하기 위한 우리의 노력이 무엇일까? 여기에서 Sustaining Peace에 대해서 이야기해 보는 것이 오늘의 주제이고 우리들의 목적인 것 같습니다. 평화 없이는 발전 없다. 또 평화 없이는 또 인간 존엄성이 존중될 수가 없다라는 이러한 문제에 대해서 특별하게 많은 사람들이 최근에 더욱더 관심을 가지고 있습니다. 그리고 또 특히 지금 한반도에서는 그동안 오랫동안 분단과 냉전 상태에 있었던 이 한반도가 이제 평화 체제로의 전환이 가능할 수 있을까? 비핵화가 이루어지고 평화 체제로서의 가능성이 이루어질 수 있을까? 이루어질 수도 있을 것 같다. 이루어질 수 있도록 만들어야 되겠다. 이런 꿈을 저희들이 한반도에서 대한민국에서는 키우고 있습니다. 그렇기 때문에 오늘 이 평화를 위한 이 우리의 포럼이 특별한 관심을 가지고 있고 매우 적절한 시기에 또 서울에서 이루어지게 된 거 아닐까 하는 생각을 해보게 됩니다. 한반도에서의 이러한 평화에 대한 관심, 한반도에 살고 있는 사람들의 이러한 관심이 세계의 여러 평화를 사랑하시는 여러분들과 함께 공감할 수 있기를 바라고, 또 우리의 이러한 절절한 요구가, 우리의 희망이 여기저기에서 일어나고 있는 분쟁 국가의 사람들과 함께 공감의 폭을 넓힐 수 있는 그러한 기회가 될 수 있지 않겠는가 하는 생각을 해봅니다. 자기 문제로 와닿지 않으면은 공감이 확실하게 줄어드는 것이 어리석은 인간들의 또 한계이기도 한 것 같습니다. 그렇기 때문에 한반도 평화를 바라는 우리 한국 사람들의 절절한 요구가 올라오는 것과 동시에 우리 한국 사람들이 세계의 평화, 세계의 분쟁, 그리고 그 속에서 고통당하고 있는 사람들에 대한 관심, 이런 걸로 연대, 이런 걸로 넓혀질 수 있지 않은가 하는 생각을 가지고 이 포럼이 가지는 의미가 더 크다 하는 생각을 합니다. 그래서 오늘 우리 이 포럼을 통해서 이 앞으로 분쟁 위기 자체가 어떻게 우리가 예방할 수가 있는가, 이런 문제에 대해서 더욱더 많은 토론과 성찰이 이루어질 수 있기를 바라면서 다시 한번 참석해 주신 여러분께 감사드립니다. 고맙습니다.
네, 이사장님의 기획사 말씀 감사드리겠습니다. 다음으로 UNDP DR 콩고 사무소의 로렌 루다싱화 부대표님께서 축사를 해주시겠습니다. 큰 박수로 받아주시기 바랍니다.
Before starting my speech, I would like to really thank COICA, the president of COICA, the COICA team member, for having associated us from UNDP DRC. We traveled for 16 hours to be here. As Madam President said, this is a very critical moment for all of us as we are closing the accounts. We are reporting back. It's the end of the year. But the fact that we came all along from DRC to be here is that we pretty much and very much put emphasis on this subject, which is of our common interest. So, Madam President, COICA staff, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. So, Madam President, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, I'm very honored to address this August Assembly on the occasion of the 41st Development Cooperation Forum co-organized by COICA and the United Nations Development Program, the DRC. This forum is an opportunity to discuss ways and means to strengthen peace building so that the assistance provided to the population and the support provided to the public administration where we are serving, as well as institutions, guarantee inclusive and sustainable development. Without peace, there's no development. Sustaining peace is therefore at the center of development issues. And let me just recall the 40th high-level forum on aid effectiveness that was held in this country, in Busan, in December 2011. That's where the country committed themselves, together with donors and civil society, under the framework of what we all call the New Deal that focuses on peace building and state building to ensure that conflict and post-conflict countries achieve resilience, because that's what we are aiming to. With the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals, called SDGs, by the UN member state in September 2015 under the International Development Agenda, the deadline for which 2030. The issue of sustaining peace has once again been strengthened through SDG 16, sustaining peace, which aim by 2030 to promote peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development and provide access to justice for all, build effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions, and at all levels. In addition, the principle of human and development peace, what we call the triple nexus, and the element of the new way of working, as it was recommended during the World Humanitarian Summit in Istanbul in May 2016, once again emphasized the concerted work of the actors working in the field of humanitarian development and peace to reduce the causes of vulnerability that lead to urgency and humanitarian, to contribute to the promotion of peaceful states that ensure inclusive and sustainable development to the people. Madam President, ladies and gentlemen, it is the vision that UNDP is working in the Democratic Republic of Congo, together with the MONUSCO, the UN mission in the Congo, represented here by Richard. DRC, for those who doesn't know, is one of the biggest countries in Africa, 2.3 million square meters. It's huge, like a continent, with immense potential in terms of both human wealth, around 80 million of population, and in terms of wealth of the land, the forest, the land, and the underground, lots of rich minerals. As I said, DRC is the second largest country of the African continent, but it's facing enormous challenges, and one of them is how to sustain peace. So UNDP interventions in DRC, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, are geared towards building sustainable peace, having strong administrations and institutions, and the civil society that is capable of exercising citizen control over policies, programs, and public actions. But this has to be done only if we manage to sustain peace. So to achieve this, UNDP is working closely with all bilateral and multilateral partners and other sister agencies, including the United Nations Stabilization Mission, MONUSCO. UNDP is also working with all administrations at national, provincial, territorial level, district levels, and with organizations and institutions which are involved in the nexus between humanitarian development and peace. Why should we do that? Because for those who knows what is happening, what have happened in Congo, we have been into the humanitarian mood, settings for the last 20 years, doing what we all call life savings. But if we go into the figure, we will see that despite the fact that we have been intervening in the humanitarian arena for 20 years, because of obvious reasons, cyclic conflict, the eastern part of the country is always, until today, as I'm talking, there are some conflicts that are there. The humanitarian have contributed a lot in terms of stabilizing the population, in terms of giving the first aid to the population. But yet, I think it's time to see how we can link it up with the development theory. So for that, UNDP have set up a task force together with other donors for the implementation of the Nexus. with its core funding, with those of various donors, UNDP in DRC have run several programs covering various themes which put a particular emphasis on sustaining peace and construction of peaceful society where all community must live in harmony to help economic development of their regions and the country. We are very committed to sustainable development goals. For that, we as UNDP in DRC manage to assist the government of DRC in the development, formulation of the national plan for development. To do so, we managed to domesticate and prioritize 38 sustainable development goals and targets, 58 indicators for monitoring till 2030, because you cannot talk about development without setting up targets and indicators that will allow you to monitor how you are achieving peace. And to do that, there was a strong exercise whereby, together with the Minister of Planning, we put it together a critical team of experts, and we managed to narrow down to 38 SDGs and 58 indicators. This exercise was also carried out in 8 provinces. Actually, it's an ongoing exercise. Again, DRC is a huge country with 26 provinces, and out of 26 provinces, we as UNDP focused our intervention on 8 conflict-prone regions in the eastern part of Congo. But our aim is to pursue that exercise. And I'm happy to say here, with a strong collaboration with COICA office in DRC, under the New Deal program, we managed to do fragility assessment, which was a very participatory exercise with the community and come up with a very real, up-to-date diagnosis of the issue that take into account not only the humanitarian needs, but at the same time, recovery, stabilization, and development needs. So it's an ongoing exercise that we count to pursue in coming days. So the New Deal, peace building, and state building goals are inclusive politics, security, justice, economic foundations, and revenue and services. And we supported the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, to establish a new roadmap for a compact through fragile to fragile peer learning mechanism between DRC and Sierra Leone, which is another conflict-prone country, but which is stabilizing and recovering for years of war. So we thought that it was good to learn through the New Deal and peer-to-peer review mechanism. And through that experience, we found that the support to the implementation of National Strategic Development Plan will also fuel into the DRC1. So all these elements help DRC to strengthen its national, provincial, and local development planning process. Indeed, there are analyses that makes it possible to fix the objective diagnosis and to identify the realistic and relevant action allowing access to sustaining peace and inclusive and sustainable development. Madam President of COICA, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, in all the work done in DRC, again, sustaining peace is a very important aspect of our work. We need to ensure that the well-being of the people, I think you said it in your speech, that we tend to serve, to build a strong administration and institution again. And in this vein, in all our intervention, UNDP ensures that the achievement of SDG 16 for DRC, that is to say the promotion of peaceful and inclusive society for sustainable development, the insurance of access to justice for all, and build effective, accountable, and inclusive at all levels is happening. I cannot conclude my speech without to really thank the authority of South Korea, South Korean people, for the hospitality we have experienced since 2 days. Many thanks to the President of COICA and the entire COICA team for the support of peace research initiative and sustainable solution to the problem of the people of the world, including in DRC. This is an opportunity to highlight the good partnership that is currently going on with COICA in DRC. We have a lot of initiatives that are going on, focusing on the SDG 5 and SDG 16, and I really want to highlight this strong and win-win partnership that we hope to pursue in coming days. And the fact that we are here together to organize this event is a strong sign towards a bright future for the population we intend to serve. So to this end, I'd like to strengthen UNDP commitment to achieving collective and sustainable results implemented through a coherent and integrated approach of all partners to ensure, again, sustaining peace in the world in general and in DRC in particular. Lastly, let me say some few words. DR Congo와 한반도 외 지속 지역 평화를 기원합니다. 감사합니다.
Thanks, Mr. Ludasingwa, for making the greatest remark. 그러면 다음에는 본격적으로 발표 세션 들어가기에 앞서서 이미경 이사장님 및 그다음에 미스터 루다싱와를 비롯해서 연사 및 토론자분들께서 앞으로 나오셔서 같이 잠깐의 포토타임을 갖도록 하겠습니다. 네, 그럼 이제 본격적으로 본 세션, 발표 세션에 들어가도록 하겠습니다. 네, 좀 기계가 좀 설치되는 동안에 제가 연사분에 대해 좀 소개를 드리겠습니다. 여러분 다 아시다시피 평화지속화 논의 관련해서는 현재 지금 크게 두 가지 기제가 있는데요. 첫 번째는 저희가 유엔 중심으로 진행되고 있는 SDG 16 플러스 논의가 있을 것이고요. 두 번째로는 유엔과 월드뱅크와 같이 공동 연구한 Pathway for Peace 관련된 논의가 있을 것입니다. 오늘 발표자이신 데이비드 스티븐 부센터장님께서는 이러한 SDG 16 논의를 주도하신 담당 운영자이시기도 하시고요. 그리고 Pathway for Peace 보고서를 발간하는 데 있어서 선임 외무 고문을 담당을 하셨습니다. 이에 오늘 데이비드 부센터장님을 모시고 두 기제 중에서도 특히 SDG 16 플러스에 관련해서 좀 살펴보고자 하는데요. SDG 16 플러스는 저희 SDG 16을 다 아실 텐데 이 16 목표를 좀 SDG 전체 차원에서 포괄적으로 이행을 어떻게 할 수 있을지를 살펴보는 이니셔티브입니다. 그래서 이 SDG 16 플러스 차원에서 평화 이슈를 어떻게 해석할 수 있고 그리고 SDG 전체 프레임워크 내에서도 폭력 감소 논의가 어떻게 평화 지속화로 연결될 수 있을지에 대해서 말씀 주시겠습니다. 큰 박수를 받아주시기 바랍니다. 데이비드.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. It's an enormous pleasure to be here. It's my first time in Korea. I've been here a couple of days. I'm just getting over the jet lag, but it's really great to be with you today. What I'm going to do today is talk a little bit about the work that we're doing on the Sustainable Development Goals on SDG 16. You've just heard about that on SDG 16 plus. I'm an Associate Director at the Center on International Cooperation at NYU. We have a commitment to peace. We have a strong peace building and prevention program. We run the Pathfinders for Peaceful, Just, Inclusive Societies, which I'll talk about. And we're also host to the Congo Research Group. So many ways that we're relevant to today's discussion. Let me just get this clacker. So today, what I'm going to talk to you about is I'm going to introduce the Pathfinders for Peaceful, Just, Inclusive Societies. I'm going to explain a little bit about what we mean by peace, justice, and inclusion within the Sustainable Development Goals and introduce the concept of SDG 16 plus. I'm then going to highlight SDG 16.1, which asks us to significantly reduce all forms of violence everywhere. And then I'm going to talk about the ambition of halving global violence and how we can use that to inspire a global movement for peace. So first of all, the Pathfinders. The Pathfinders is a global partnership, a multi-stakeholder partnership that came together around the SDG 16 plus targets. So we set these very ambitious targets for peaceful, just, inclusive societies, and immediately in their wake, in the agreement of those targets, a group of member states in the UN, international organizations, private sector businesses, civil society networks came together around the implementation of these targets, and we worked very closely with the Global Alliance, which exists to report progress on peaceful, just, inclusive societies, and also the 16 Plus Forum, and you'll hear from Maggie later about that, I am sure. In 2017 at the General Assembly, we published the Roadmap for Peaceful, Just, Inclusive Societies. I think many of you have a copy of this document, and that's a first guide to the implementation of the SDG 16 Plus targets, and I'll explain a little bit about the roadmap and what it means during the talk. We have a number of countries involved. The partnership was originally founded by the governments of Brazil, Sierra Leone and of Switzerland, along with the Centre on International Cooperation. And we have many other countries, also international organisation, groups of countries like the G7 plus and some of the key players in peace building, the World Bank and from the UN. This is a quick sketch of the roadmap. I won't go in detail into the roadmap because you have copies of that in front of you. But what the roadmap does is it starts with the targets in the 2030 Agenda for Peace, Justice and Inclusion. It proposes 3 transformative strategies, one around prevention, one around institutional renewal at a time when in all societies we need our institutions to do more to deliver sustainable development, and one around inclusion, around social, political, social, political and economic empowerment at a time when many people in many societies feel excluded from the future. And then we propose some catalytic actions that aim to be very practical about what implementation looks like. And then the enablers around evidence and data, finance, learning and exchange, and communications, advocacy and movement building. The Pathfinders acts as an action platform. We often call it a docking station. It's intended to bring many different partners together behind the question of implementation. So we take the roadmap, we act as a platform for implementation, and then we support national delivery. So we work with countries to explore the commitments that they can make towards implementation of the SDG 16 plus targets. We work at the international level to bring together partners to give more coordinated support to these targets. So we have groups working on violence against children. We have a group that I'll mention in a minute that's working on the Pathways for Peace report, implementation of that report, a group working on safe cities, etc., etc. And then we have what we call the grand challenges, so 3 areas of initiative where we're challenging ourselves to step up and do more. We have a task force on justice chaired by ministers from Argentina, from the Netherlands, also from Sierra Leone, and by the elders, which is looking at the implementation of the targets for justice. We've just begun a grand challenge on the links between exclusion and inequality, the link between SDG 10 and SDG 16. I was here for the OECD forum yesterday talking about that, and we're also exploring SDG 16.1, and that will be the subject of a lot of my talk today. Next year, as I'll come and explain, we have a lot of political opportunities. We have a high-level political forum and also the first SDG 16 summit. So we really see 2019 as an opportunity to step up and do more. But first of all, let me give you a little bit of background on the targets. The 2030 agenda, it has SDG 16, the target, which sets 12 targets for promoting peace, justice, and inclusion. But when we look through the agenda at all of the 17 goals, we find many targets that talk about an aspect of peace, an aspect of justice, or an aspect of inclusion. And this is what it looks like. This is the cluster for peaceful societies. If I can get this pointer to work, yeah. Up in the top there we have SDG 16.1 for all forms of violence, but around the side here we have many other targets for different forms of violence, for violence against women, for violence against children, for specific forms of abuse like FGM, child labour, child soldiers, etc., etc. So targets from targets from Goal 16, from Goal 5, from Goal 10, etc. And then over on the other side, we have some targets for safe spaces, how we build a world that is safe for people to live in, safe schools, safe cities, safe transport, safe environments. And then up here, the important target from education around a culture of peace and non-violence. For just societies, we have a headline target, SDG 16.3, which promises access to justice for all by 2030. But then we have a series of targets that talk about either the foundations for justice, like legal identity and birth registration, specific forms of injustice, like corruption or illicit financial flows, and then round this side here, a whole suite of targets for human rights and gender equality that speak to a more ambitious vision of what we mean by a just society. And then we have the targets for inclusion, for inclusive societies, which split basically into 2. Targets for effective, accountable and transparent institutions at all levels, which rolls out in other targets, so in other goals, so in other words, governance targets. And then on the other side, targets for social, economic and political inclusion. So we need better governed societies, but we also need societies that promote inclusion and participation. So these are the 36 SDG 16 plus targets. This is the challenge the 2030 agenda has given us. And what the Pathfinders is trying to do is bring that challenge into reality, to build a group of, why we call them Pathfinders, a group of countries and other actors who are prepared to lead the change, to demonstrate what is possible so that others can follow. So let me just click that on. The targets are universal. It's very important to realise that the SDGs apply to all countries, Every country in the world has problems with peace, has problems with violence, it has problems with injustice, it has problems with exclusion. It needs to work on its institutions. And we're seeing a very different type of dialogue emerging with countries from all parts of the world working together on peaceful, just, inclusive societies. But the agenda also promises to leave no one behind and to reach the furthest behind first. And we know that on current trends, around half, the figure that the World Bank estimated was between 43 and 60% of the extreme poor will live in conflict-affected and fragile states on current trends. These were countries that found it very difficult to deliver the Millennium Development Goals and are likely to struggle to deliver the Sustainable Development Goals unless we do something about peace, justice, and inclusion in those countries. So on the one hand, universal, but on the other with a great focus on the countries, the communities and the people who are most likely to be left behind because of their experience of violence, their experience of injustice, their experience of exclusion. This really is what provides the link between SDG 16+ and sustaining peace. Sustaining peace talks about prevention along a continuum from the outbreak, the escalation, the continuance and the recurrence of conflict. It talks about not responding to conflict after it's happened, but trying to address root causes. And it talks about trying to build a progression from conflict to more natural and normal sustainable patterns of development. So SDG 16+ provides the aspiration, but for the countries that are most at risk of being left behind due to conflict, sustaining peace provides us with a specialized set of strategies and tools for delivery of the targets for peaceful, just, inclusive societies in those countries. So that's the broad picture. SDG 16+, a set of very ambitious targets, a group of countries that's come together to try and implement those targets, working with partners from the international system, from private sector, from civil society, and from other parts, trying to work universally, but also really trying to focus on the challenges of the countries that are most at risk of being left behind. And this is where I come on to SDG 16.1. I think it's absolutely clear that unless we do something about very high levels of violence in our societies, then it will be impossible to deliver the Sustainable Development Goals. So all 17 goals will fail unless we get serious about violence. And SDG 16.1 is the target that challenges us to take that seriously. It's a very ambitious target. It says that we're going to significantly reduce all forms of violence everywhere. So all forms of violence in all countries, and a significant quantified measurable reduction in levels of violence between now and the expiration of the 2030 agenda in 13 or so years time. At the moment, we're far off track. We see that conflict and non-conflict violence are pervasive parts of the lives of very, very many people in the world. More than 500,000 people are killed violently each year, and many more suffer physical injuries from violence. And then beyond the physicality of violence, we have a whole spectrum of negative behavioral, cognitive, mental health, sexual and reproductive problems, chronic diseases, social effects, and then economic impacts. So we have violence as a cause of an extraordinary number of damaging impacts on people, communities, and societies that spread out from there. So we're therefore seeing that people are being left behind due to their experience of violence, but then violence is making it more likely that they will be left behind. So there's a vicious cycle happening there. And we find that the burden falls disproportionately on certain countries and certain communities, and it always hits the vulnerable hardest. So it's a major, it's very closely interrelated with poverty and entrenches poverty. And then we also know that on current trends, SDG 16.1 is not going to be met. We are not on track to deliver a significant reduction in all forms of violence everywhere if we continue with business as usual. So I'm going to show you what that looks like. These are some scenarios that are taken. The solid lines are where we are now, and these are some projections that take us forward from 2015 to 2030. 2030. So on a business as usual trend, we will see a slight increase, around a 10% increase in levels of lethal violence, and presumably therefore also in non-lethal violence and the consequences of violence. So we promised, leaders have come together and promised a significant reduction in violence, and in fact we're going to see violence on a slight increase. We're going to see potentially an increase in conflict after a period in the 1990s and early 2000s when we thought conflict was on the decline. We're seeing an increase in conflict, and that could continue. And we're also going to see a decline. Well, we're going to see a decline in the rate of homicides, we would expect, but not fast enough to account for population growth. So the number of people dying will continue to grow, and that's only a business as usual scenario. Add in some slightly more pessimistic assumptions, and the levels of violence grow quite considerably. If we see some new conflicts erupting, if we see an intensification of violence, particularly in new urban areas, so therefore particularly in Africa, we could see a very substantial increase in violence, leading to from a current figure of around 500,000 violent deaths each year up to around 819,000 violent deaths each year. So an increase in significant increase there of around 46%. So let's move on and look a little bit about the different types of violence, and I want to look at conflict violence and non-conflict violence and how the two are interrelated. Violent conflict actually only accounts for around 1 in 5, around 20% of all violent deaths, but its consequences are much greater. In Africa, for example, that we know that armed conflict has led to very substantial increases in infant mortality. For every conflict death, for every direct death from conflict, we would expect 3 to 4 children to die an early death, but to die before their 5th birthday due to the broader impacts of conflict. So we see conflict as a significant cause of death, but having much greater impacts on children and then more broadly on society. And then there are other impacts such as displacement. We now have around 70 million people displaced, most of them due to conflict in their countries. In recent years, the Pathways for Peace report that you heard mentioned in the introduction report I worked on and contributed to the final chapter, the chapter on recommendations. That report talks about a surge in expansion of violent conflicts. We now have more countries experiencing conflict than at any time in the past 30 years, and those conflicts are becoming more violent and more complex to respond to. According to Pathways, there are 3 main causes of this. First of all, the wave of violence that followed the Arab Spring, so a moment of hope, but that has led to conflict in many societies. Second, the spread of violent extremism and the growth of the number of non-state actors that are engaged in conflict. And thirdly, in many African countries, the competition for power that reflects very rapid economic, social and demographic changes. So societies changing rapidly and a competition for power within those societies. All of those are driving higher levels of conflict. But wars are not isolated from other forms of violence. It's a mistake to make a very abrupt distinction between conflict and non-conflict violence. We see conflict, violent extremism, criminal violence, interpersonal violence, all very strongly interrelated. We see if there are human rights abuses in a society, that's a risk factor for conflict. It makes conflict more likely to happen, but it's also conflict then also feeds further human rights and rights abuses. We see in every conflict a surge in violence against women and against children. Gender-based violence during a conflict, but then carrying on for many years afterwards, 10 or 20 years afterwards, we can see the echo effects of that conflict. And then children who are brought up in conflict environments are both more at risk of being victims and perpetrators of violence later in life due to a variety of reasons for a variety of ways that their development has been disrupted. So in societies we see that conflict paves the way for higher tolerance of interpersonal violence, increased weapons and drug smuggling and therefore organised crime, and higher levels of political corruption. So various forms of violence going together. On the other side, we have non-conflict violence, and we find that this is also very unevenly distributed. relatively few people living in relatively few places are much the greatest risk of being murdered, of being victims of homicide. Often in very small areas of highly violent cities, we find violence rates that are as high as conflict zones. So we see a great inequality in the distribution of violence. At the moment, we have roughly 4 billion people in the world that live in places where you're at very low risk of being a victim of homicide. And we have just 10% of the global population, or around 700 million people, living in places that you're at very high risk of being a victim of homicide. The most vulnerable people, women, children, and young men, in very different ways. Women, you probably heard the statistic, but around a third of women are believed to have been victims of physical or sexual violence at the hands of their partner, or to have been victims of non-partner sexual abuse. And we now believe that roughly 1 billion children, so half the world's children, are victims of some form of relatively serious violence each year. So violence for children is a very pervasive part of people's lives. And then we have other forms of violence like FGM, child marriage, child labour. So around 1 in 10 children work before the age of 17, for example. So high rates of conflict, isolated to a few countries, but with great consequences. And then in many countries, but still for relatively small numbers of people, high rates of lethal violence, but then rates of violence against women and children that are very spread across societies. So that's the current situation we're in. And the question that's being asked now is, can we turn the adverse trends on SDG 16.1, where we're expecting to see an increase in violence, into a decrease? And I think the answer to that is probably yes, if we're prepared to invest. In fact, if we were serious about this, we could move from the high level of violence down to a reduction in a level of by half in a period of 15 or 20 years. We find this expert consensus emerging in a number of places. We have the Pathways for Peace report that argues that the shift to prevention is both possible and it would be highly cost effective. In other words, we're spending much more money on violence. We're spending a large sum of money on violence. If we save that money and spend it on the response to violence, if we save that money and spent it on prevention, then that would be highly cost effective. The Pathways for report sets out a framework that's highly aligned to SDG 16 plus. So peaceful societies and more just societies, we need to invest in justice within societies that have a high risk of violence. We need justice to manage conflicts over land, conflicts over natural resources, conflict over access to power, conflict over access to public services, etc. Peaceful societies also have better governance. We need to invest in institutions if we're serious about prevention. And we also need more inclusive approaches to prevention. This was a core message of the Pathways for Peace report. Conflict is driven by patterns of exclusion and the grievances that causes. We therefore need to invest in including groups, including communities in the future sustainable development of their societies. So in Pathways for Peace, we have a vision endorsed by the United Nations and the World Bank that sets out a vision for how we could get serious about prevention of the worst forms of conflict. We then have other pieces of work that are beginning to look at the reductions of interpersonal violence. So in 2015, we had the first global violence reduction conference, which concluded that a global reduction of violence by 50% in the next 30 years, it said, is achievable if policymakers harness the power of scientific evidence on violence reduction. And there's an incredible amount of scientific evidence out there. We increasingly know what it takes to reduce levels of interpersonal violence. In fact, in the Global Status Report on Violence Prevention, the World Health Organization set out 6 strategies for doing that. And then we have the Inspired package of strategies that we worked on with with the World Bank, with UNICEF, with WHO, which sets out 7 strategies for reducing violence against children. I won't go into the evidence in detail, but all of this looks at the evidence of what works and boils that down into lessons that policymakers can take forward. So for conflict, for all forms of non-conflict violence, and then for specific forms of violence, such as violence against women and violence against children, we now have quite a strong global consensus about what works. These are multi-sectoral approaches. They're population-based, so in other words, they are developed out of understanding the risk factors for violence and the protective factors for violence. They require multi-sectoral partnerships for implementation, so partnerships that bring together people working on land or on housing, with people working on social protection or education or on health, with people who are working directly on conflict resolution, on mediation, on addressing disputes. We also have a growing body of evidence looking at cities and how you can intervene in cities and reduce violence in the most affected communities by rebuilding the relationship between communities on the one hand, the young men who are driving the high levels of violence, and the criminal justice actors who often have a low level of trust with communities, often abusive in those communities. If you can rebuild those relationships, we've seen in some cities conflict decline by 50% in just 5 or 6 years, so incredibly rapidly with the right interventions. So we know what to do. It's not easy. Nobody would say it is easy. But we have a strong and growing consensus about what to do. The question is, are we going to go ahead and do it? Are we going to go ahead and make that happen? I think there are some positive signs. I mentioned the partnership around the Pathways for Peace report. For the first time, this has really brought the World Bank and the United Nations together on one page around prevention. We had, I'm not sure how long ago it was now, but we had the New Deal, and particularly in the New Deal, the G7 plus group of countries, so a group of fragile and conflict-affected countries, coming together around a new consensus about what they think a path from conflict to a more resilient pattern of development looks like. And now we're beginning to see a wave of new partnerships that are inspired by the Sustainable Development Goals. So we have the Global Partnership to End Violence Against Children, which now has 40 Pathfinder countries working on implementing the INSPIRE strategies. We have the Spotlight Initiative to eliminate violence against women. Within the Vision for Africa, to Africa 2063, we have the Silencing Guns by 2020 initiative. In Latin America, there's a new movement to reduce levels of homicide within Latin America in a 10-year period. And we have some specialist partnerships emerging, like Alliance 8.7, which works on child labour and modern slavery. So we're beginning to see a growth in activity, bringing countries together, experimenting with new approaches, increasing the scale of implementation. But it's not enough. I think we would see that there are, at the moment, 3 obstacles that are inhibiting greater action. First of all, most of our advocacy is around problems rather than solutions. We talk about how serious violence is. We don't talk nearly enough about what the evidence tells us about how to respond to violence more effectively. Secondly, we're spending most of our money on ineffective approaches. We're spending our money on response, or we're spending our money on very coercive responses to violence, rather than the inclusive approaches to prevention that we know are most effectively. And thirdly, we have no single point of ownership within the international system for reducing all forms of violence. We see it a very fragmented picture. We have people working on violence against women who never talk to people working on violence against children. We talk people who have expertise in urban violence who don't talk to people who are working on conflict prevention. So we have a very fragmented picture. So what I think we need to do is we need to build political will that violence is not just a problem, but it's a preventable epidemic, that the solutions are real and that they exist. We need to unite partners behind a compelling vision and strategy for what that reduction in violence looks like. We need to focus urgent attention on the places where most of the violence exists, and that is conflict zones and the most violent cities, and that is where we can achieve the fastest reductions in violence with the right policies and interventions and approaches. And then we need to do the hard and long-term work of transforming the harmful social gender norms that support a culture of violence and building a culture of peace, changing the way that children are brought up, having a revolution in parenting and building a more peaceful generation for the future. So political will, recognizing that we have an epidemic of violence and that we're prepared to do something about it. A vision and a strategy that we can make the change happen. Targeted prevention on the violence hotspots, and then the broader long-term work to build more peaceful societies. And I think this is the year to do it, or next year is the year to do it. So I must just take some water. I was excited to come here to Korea for many reasons, but one reason is that in February you have the Pyeongchang Global Peace Forum, and there will be a new global appeal for peace in that year. My feeling is that within the global appeal for peace, SDG 16.1, the challenge to significantly reduce all forms of violence everywhere should be a central part of that global appeal. We should challenge the international community to get serious about a quantified, measurable reduction in violence. Just as we tried to halve poverty in the MDG era, we should start trying to halve violence in the SDG era. And I think the Pyeongchang Forum, with its global appeal for peace, could start that process going forward. In July, then, we have the High-Level Political Forum. This is the first ministerial meeting that will review progress on SDG 16, also on SDG 10. This is an opportunity for countries, we just heard the example from DRC, countries that have a roadmap, countries that have a plan, countries that have commitments, to come to New York and talk about those commitments and their plan to step up. And then in September, we have the International Day of Peace. I think this is an opportunity to take the global appeal for peace that is launched in February and bring that to New York on the 21st of September 2019, just before the SDG summit. So every 4 years, like the Olympics of the SDGs, we have a head of state, a head of government summit, a meeting where presidents and prime ministers are invited to come to New York to review progress on the SDGs, but critically to mobilize further actions to accelerate implementation. So to come to New York and talk about actions, about the solutions, and I think we should come with a clear sense of what the solutions are on building peaceful, just, inclusive societies, but particularly on reducing all forms of violence everywhere. We should do that as part of an acceleration, a clear increase in ambition, and then we should build a bigger mobilization. We should build this inclusive partnership for peace that is the title of this meeting. So that is the SDGs. That's SDG 16 plus. That's SDG 16.1, the challenge of our age to reduce violence. And that, I think, is what we should begin in February at the Pyeongchang Global Peace Forum and bring to fruition in September at the SDG Summit. Thank you.
네, 데이비드 스티븐 부센터장님의 발표 감사드립니다. 부센터장님께서 말씀 주신 것처럼 지금 저희가 SDG 16 플러스 그리고 평화 논의와 관련해서 분쟁을 예방하고 평화를 지속하는 논의에 대해서는 여러 국가들을 그리고 국제기구에서도 많은 동의를 한 상태고요. 그렇다면 이게 가장 중요한 것은 이걸 어떻게 전략화를 해서 국내 차원에서 이걸 이행을 할 수 있을지가 관건이 될 것인데요. 여기에 대해서 바로 저희 마가렛 윌리엄 선임 담당관님께서 이제 발표를 해주실 겁니다. 저희 두 번째 발표인 마가렛 윌리엄스 유엔 협회 세계연맹 평화안보 선임 담당관님에 대해서 잠깐 소개를 드리면요. 저희 그 마가렛 윌리엄스 담당관님께서는 현재 유엔 협회 세계연맹에서 SDG 16 플러스 이니셔티브를 관련하여 어떻게 이 이니셔티브를 국별 전략으로 넣을 수 있을지에 대해서 지금 담당을 하고 계십니다. 그래서 오늘 발표를 통해서 평화지속화 논의를 실제로 어떻게 저희가 국별 전략으로 반영을 할 수 있을지에 대해서 많은 함의를 주시지 않을까 싶습니다. 큰 박수로 받아주시기 바랍니다.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, especially to COICA and to all partners here today. I'm delighted to be here. I'm honored to be here. This is an exciting time and an exciting forum. So I just would like to thank all again, and in particular President Lee, for having us. Just as a quick bit of introduction, my name is Margaret Williams. I'm the Senior Peace and Security Officer at the World Federation of United Nations Associations, and I'm also the coordinator of something that we have called the 16+ Forum. Now, just a very little bit on WFUNA, if I may. So my NGO, the World Federation of UN Associations, was founded shortly after the UN and represents around 100 UN associations all around the world, working towards a stronger and more effective United Nations. As part of the Secretariat of WFUNA, we have offices in New York, Geneva, and also Seoul. So while this is my first time to Seoul, I feel like I should have come here before. So thank you for the welcome and for providing the path. A few years ago, a poll was taken of all of our UN associations on the SDGs, and which of the SDGs our members thought might be most important and most relevant for WFUNA as the umbrella organization to focus on. Goal 4 was mentioned and was high up on the list. Goal 5 was as well. But Goal 16 was that goal, that component of the SDGs that most of our members wanted us to focus on. So SDG 16 came out on top as our priority, and here I am. And that's why we then started something called the 16+ Forum. The 16+ Forum was launched in 2016, shortly after the adoption of the 2030 Agenda. And in short, what the 16+ Forum tries to do is it tries to bring together all the various stakeholders, sectors, communities, practitioners, et cetera, working on SDG 16 and SDG 16+, in order to focus the conversation on implementation and the practicality of advancing the policy and practice of SDG 16. When we say SDG 16+, as David mentioned earlier, it's SDG 16, its related targets across the 2030 Agenda, and of course its links to sustaining peace. As part of the forum, we have 10 partner member states, including the Republic of Korea, as well as the G7+, and then WFUNA as the NGO. As an NGO, we also find it to be of particular importance to make sure that the voices of civil society are included in these conversations, and that it's elevated to the level of playing field of government and UN. In many of these contexts, civil society organizations are the service providers, are the service deliverers, and so one of our primary points of advocacy, but also of showcasing implementation, is to really highlight the work of civil society organizations all around the world in advancing peaceful, just, and inclusive societies. So, with that brief introduction into the 16+ Forum, I'd like to quickly get into what it is that we kind of most pride ourselves on, if you will, and that is putting together and putting on something every year called the Annual Showcase. So I say every year as though it's been going on for many years. We've actually just only had our second in Sierra Leone this past year, and our first was in Tbilisi, Georgia, last year in 2017. This model was a bit of an unproven one when we first launched the 16+ Forum, when we first launched the Annual Showcase. But again, basically what we try to do is over the course of several days, highlight best practices in SDG 16+ implementation across stakeholders and across communities and across the globe, global north, global south, as David mentioned before, picking up on the universality of the agenda and the importance for all to work on peace, inclusion, and justice. So over the course of these 4 days, we have a CSO capacity building workshop, which is basically intended to bring together various civil society organizations from highly localized grassroots organizations to large international networks to bridge the gap within that own sector, within the NGO sector, and to focus on points of entry, whether it's on advocacy or implementation around Goal 16. In addition to a capacity building workshop for civil society organizations, we then do field visits. So in Georgia, in Tbilisi, Georgia, this included visits to public service halls in the Ministry of Justice. In Sierra Leone, where we just had our second showcase, these field visits included visits to the Law Reform Commission, Financial Intelligence Unit, so government institutions working on SDG 16+, as well as to various local NGOs focused on peace building, prevention, bridging the gap between formal and informal institutions, et cetera. And the whole reason why we do these field visits is to make Goal 16 real. So for those that come to the annual showcase, to take something that can sound very esoteric and very academic in some ways and show the impact. So this is what it means, and this is the result of advancing SDG 16+. So after the CSO visits, the CSO capacity building workshop and the field visits, then we get into more of the nitty-gritty, kind of typical conference gathering of breakout and panel discussions. So throughout all of this, advancing peaceful, just, and inclusive societies is addressed by various stakeholders at various levels. So these are governments from ministers to mayors, civil society organizations from grassroots organizations that had otherwise never heard of the SDGs but had been working on human rights for 20 years, to larger international networks that helped actually craft the 2030 agenda, the UN, UN resident coordinators, various members of the country team, private sector, and media. And out of this, we basically have a sharing of best practices. And so that is why I am here in front of you today, to share a little bit about what has recently come out of the second 16+ Forum Annual Showcase in Sierra Leone, in Freetown, Sierra Leone this October. That was actually right before the F2F capacity building workshop. Sierra Leone, for those, I'm sure many are familiar, but Sierra Leone, for those who don't know, is a country that has been very much affected by conflict. However, there are many positives to pick up on, and many examples of SDG 16 at work in that context. And so I thought, for starters, to talk about the actual SDG 16+ and implementation, I would start with some local examples that were highlighted in Freetown and that are Sierra Leone specific. So, as we know and as we've discussed, sustaining peace is, in short, to prevent the outbreak, escalation, continuation, or recurrence of conflict. The 2030 Agenda contains a blueprint of the common vision of a society towards the world is trying to move, with SDG 16 being the main goal to foster peaceful, just, and inclusive societies, free from fear and violence. The composite is a framework that spans development, governance, and the peace-building nexus with clear and powerful links to sustaining peace. As has been mentioned a couple times, no peace without development, no development without peace. But what does this mean in practice? The first example that I thought might be interesting to highlight is one that was actually just recently announced, called the National Commission for Peace and Cohesion in Sierra Leone. Recent elections earlier this year showed that the divisions in the country are still quite real, still quite impactful. There was electoral-related violence. Sierra Leone has enjoyed 4 relatively peaceful elections since the end of its civil war, but each election has been increasingly violent. What does this mean? This means that while it is moving forward, it still has components of fragility that the government is willing to address. It's doing so by launching something, by having just recently launched something called the Commission for National Peace and Cohesion. This is important because this is something that came out of the now president's campaign remarks and his first address to Parliament, but it's actually now being implemented. As mentioned by the Vice Minister of State within the Vice President's office, the issues that led to the Civil War, that were then highlighted by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, have not yet been fully addressed in Sierra Leone several years later. what this commission is going to try to do is to unpack those, to unpack the issues around governance, the lack of trust, the disconnect between formal and informal institutions and forms of governance, corruption, accountability, etc. So this is a clear example of SDG 16+ at work and sustaining peace at work. From more of a civil society perspective, and again, staying at the local level and focused on Sierra Leone, there is an organization that many of you might be familiar with called the West African Network for Peace Building, also known as WANEP. WANEP has recently launched an early warning, early response, and sustaining peace program, mostly around rural and marginalized areas because of electoral violence earlier this year. In an attempt, the specifics of WANEP's program have been to establish community monitors who, in conjunction with the Office of National Security, and this is important because it's civil society working with a government office. So WANEP, in conjunction with the Office of National Security, are training community monitors on early warning, early response, and prevention to help strengthen Sierra Leone's security architecture. The project aims to increase efficient monitoring and reporting on conflict at early warning stages as set out by predefined indicators of a district in question. So the indicators are reflective of a particular district. And ultimately the goal is that these community monitors will produce daily situation reports, which will be compiled for weekly alerts. People can understand patterns, can understand where areas might need more or less local mediation. And much of this mediation, I should also say, is done by women. So this whole program, which WANEP has already rolled out, has produced results and has increased cooperation and communication between security personnel and communities throughout the country, particularly in areas where they did experience electoral-related violence. So this is a specific program, again, working on sustaining peace, working on SDG 16+, and as reflective of a very particular context. Staying with Sierra Leone for just one more second. My task today was to talk about examples that came out of the showcases and how they specifically relate to sustaining peace and SDG 16+. So one more example that I wanted to share was actually around the National Development Plan process for Sierra Leone and National Development Strategies. For both of these processes, as we all know very well, the UN is heavily involved. What's interesting about Sierra Leone's new National Development Plan is that it has clusters that are focused on good governance accountability and another focus on women, children, and those with disabilities. Goal 16, as a set of values, actually runs throughout the development plan. So it's important to note this as an opportunity to help address issues related to prevention and to help scale those possibilities and pockets of local peace that David was mentioning earlier. The National Development Plan was also done through a highly consultative process with civil society organizations in the country. This also is important because inclusion is key. If people don't feel like they're part of the game, then why would they play? So this is another example of a positive step forward with a very supportive UN team to help build a path for Sierra Leone to stay on the path that it is on, trying to move further beyond conflict and more towards peace and towards sustainable development. These are positive examples. I will get to the challenges, but I just wanted to at least begin with some positivity from the Sierra Leone Annual Showcase that was just held. Other examples have also come up, and I think it's important, again, to highlight the universality of SDG 16+ and sustaining peace, as David was mentioning. So the Czech Republic, for example, completely different context, completely different region. They also discuss some of the challenges that they have around peace and cohesion, and particularly with their minority groups and the Roma group in particular in the Czech Republic. So very different context, but in that context, in an attempt to increase the inclusion of the Roma minority, city halls have put forth efforts to bring actual inhabitants of a town together A small example, but an effective example, is in the town of Aubernice. It only has 2,300 inhabitants, but 45% of those inhabitants are Roma. So the local government has put in place policies that are intended to integrate and include them, where they had been excluded and left behind before. Some are overtly political solutions, some are more cultural, but the point is that it's a highly localized approach. It's being done at the municipal level, and it's focused on inclusion in a country where you might not necessarily think that at the outset that these agendas are relevant in-house, but they are. And that, again, is the whole point of the universality of the 2030 Agenda, and as David mentioned, that all countries can work on peace and inclusion and violence reduction. So these were I've lost track of time, so I do apologize for that. But I wanted to start with local, and I wanted to start with civil society organizations, move to the government of Sierra Leone as the host for this last showcase, discuss the Czech Republic, and then come back to Timor-Leste, so another G7 plus country. In 2017, more than a decade after the findings and recommendations of Timor-Leste Truth and Reconciliation and the Truth and Friendship Commission with Indonesia were published, the government of Timor-Leste mandated the formation of something called the Centro Nacional Chega to facilitate the implementation of findings from both truth commissions and preserve the memory of Timor-Leste's history from the Civil War. The establishment of the CNC was the result of a decade-long effort by civil society and victims groups urging the government to fully implement the recommendations of the truth commissions. Again, there's this question of implementation that I will come to when we discuss the challenges a little bit, but it's very important to understand that you have a commission, that's one thing. What matters is in the implementation. So more than a decade after the findings, the Chega National Commission was founded in order to take the findings from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and Truth and Friendship Commission forward. The CNC is in particular focused on implementing recommendations such as the memorialization of Timor-Leste's history, the protection and mapping of historical sites, the forming of human rights training modules for government institutions, as well as a focus on education, having formed a partnership with the Ministry of Education to integrate report findings into curriculum and transform the memories and narratives into methods for healing and educating young people, in particular on nonviolence and human rights. This year, the CNC co-convened a capacity building workshop focused on strengthening education and violence prevention with educators not just from Timor, but also from Cambodia and Guatemala, with the aim of improving the ability to teach their countries' respective histories of conflict and atrocity. These workshops served as an opportunity for educators from countries who have all recently emerged from conflict to share their experience and share their best practices while simultaneously gaining tools for historical and memory preservation through education. So this was another example of SDG 16 Plus in practice and sustaining peace in practice. I have several other examples, but I thought, having gone from the local to the national, I would maybe close with a bit on the example side on the regional. So, and bringing us back to the West African region, I wanted to highlight some examples from ECOWAS that were highlighted at the showcase. So one of the celebratory stories from the West African region in terms of sustaining peace and SDG 16 Plus is the Gambia. Part of the reason why the Gambia has a success story is because of the election observer missions sent by ECOWAS. It's really important to understand the value of regional organizations to these agendas. Even if we're talking about bilateral support, one has to keep in mind the role of regional organizations in these areas and their capacity to understand the context, respond quickly, work on prevention, and have more of a sustained impact. The other example is the early response mechanisms by the AU and the EU. In 2004, the AU and the EU formed a partnership on ERM to strengthen the ability and speed at which the African Peace Facility can address crises through flexible and rapid access to funding, aimed at prevention, mediation, or resolution. The AFP is a key EU financial instrument to support peace and security efforts on the continent. Fast forward to 2017. Through the early response mechanism, the AU was able to support ECOWAS's mission to the Gambia in achieving peaceful and constitutional transitional power and the prevention and escalation of violence. So again, these are mechanisms by which peace and prevention can be implemented and can be meaningfully advanced if supported. And so with that, I can actually get to some of the challenges. Again, the whole idea of the 16+ Forum and the annual showcase is to focus on the practicality and the implementation of SDG 16+ and sustaining peace, but to not shy away from the challenges. The challenges are real, and in some cases they seem intransient, but it's best if we just discuss them openly and then we can try to move forward in order to achieve the aspirations that we all have. So one of the biggest issues that we've seen through the annual showcase and the examples that have been shared has really been in the follow-through, in the implementation. As was highlighted by the special representative of ECOWAS in Liberia, for countries in post-war contexts, monitoring progress on SDG 16 implementation is directly linked to the manner in which peace agreements are implemented or not implemented. It is important to consider if peace agreements are understood as, if a resolution of a peace agreement is understood as fully implemented once the commissions are constituted or when the recommendations of the commissions are implemented. This has direct implications for the TRC, both in Sierra Leone, as mentioned, and in Liberia. So the question is, you can have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. What matters is the follow-through. And there you have issues around political will and around financial support. So the political will issue, I think David covered quite extensively already. The financial support, I know we all know and discuss quite a bit, but this is something that we've found. And so as these countries are moving forward and trying to implement and address SDG 16+, through various policies or programs, as well as sustaining peace, it's important that partners see the long-term game and provide resources for that long-term gain, because otherwise you can have commissions and you can have findings, but if they're not actually acted upon, then it doesn't help a whole lot. So what to do kind of going forward, if you will. Implementation, implementation, implementation. This is, I think, one of our key takeaways is that it's really important to try to capture what it looks like on the ground. Process is just as important as output. So the consultation processes around something like the National Commission on Peace and Cohesion, or the Commission on Peace and National Cohesion in Sierra Leone, is really important. People have to feel included and they have to feel like they have a voice in the process. If not, it is not reflective of the entire country, and it will, it could actually increase levels of violence. Partnerships are key. So partnerships with the civil society organizations, partnerships obviously with donors, partnerships with the private sector, and innovative partnerships also within certain sectors. As David mentioned, you have these various communities working on the eradication or reduction of violence, but they don't talk to each other. It's really important that people come together, figure out what their synergies are, figure out what their comparative advantages are, and go forward. This is one of the reasons actually why we find the showcase to be so useful, because we just bring these people together and have them discuss for several days on end what implementation means and what it means for whom. All of this will hopefully lead to prevention. There's a big push for prevention once again. And this push for prevention needs to be backed up by additional evidence, additional resources, and a concerted effort on policy and partnerships. What do we have to look forward to? Ultimately, a reduction of violence. As David mentioned, this is possible, but we have to get serious and we have to see what's worked and what hasn't worked. The VNR process, the Voluntary National Review process over HLPF, provides a bit of an opportunity for this. This was the first year, interestingly, this was the first year that the president of ECOSOC had to cut off the list of countries reporting through the VNR process. There were actually too many countries that wanted to report. This is incredible. I think it's now like 52 or 53, and Ambassador King had to just say, I'm so sorry, if you guys still want to report, you can't. We're full. This year is when SDG 16, among others, is being reported on, and as we've seen, each year the VNR process gets stronger. It's more experience, there are more partners, there are more people. Through the VNRs, through the Voluntary National Reviews, we can further strengthen the evidence for SDG 16 plus and the evidence for sustaining peace. Better make that case for investment, make that case for policy, make that case for implementation. So the VNRs really do offer an opportunity. And then the last opportunity that I thought I would mention is one that's actually reflected in those with us here today. There are people here that have worked on the Open Government Partnership. There are people here that are directly involved with the New Deal. There are people here that are more focused on the 2030 Agenda or 1325, youth, peace, and security, et cetera, et cetera. There are all of these frameworks, all of these fabulously researched, really interesting game plans for trying to bring about greater peace. The question is how do we bring everybody together, and where do we see the overlap? I think that is really where true impact and the catalytic value of peace, justice, and inclusion can be found. We work very closely with the New Deal grouping, and obviously Sierra Leone is the chair of the G7 Plus consortium of countries. What will be most important if we can bring these various communities together to focus on the policy and to focus on the practice of implementing peaceful, just, and inclusive societies. And I think through this forum and through the timeline that David highlighted earlier, including with Pyongyang, we can get there, but it will take a concerted effort on all of our parts. Thank you.
네, 마가렛 윌리엄 담당관님의 발표 감사드립니다. 보셨겠지만 오늘 발표에서도 소개해 주신 것처럼 사실 이렇게 논의를 단위를 내려서 지역 차원, 국가 차원, 또 로컬 차원으로 내리는 작업이 사실 되게 쉽지 않습니다. 여기서 방향에 대한 설명을 또 주셨고, 또 저희가 내년 HLPF 고위급 정식 포럼이라고 저희가 열리는데요. 16번 이제 SDG 16번이 관련해가지고가 하나의 목표가 돼서 저희가 이제 VNR 아까 소개해 주셨는데 자발적 국별 검토라고 해서 저희가 얼마큼 국가들이 이행을 잘하고 있는지 평가를 받습니다. 이제 그런 걸 준비하는 과정에서도 저희가 또 앞으로 어떻게 16을 이행할지에 대해서도 많은 좀 귀감을 얻지 않을까 싶고요. 오늘 이렇게 좀 방향을 설명해 주신 거에 이어서 이제 세 번째 발표에서는 이거를 UNDP DR 콩고에서 실제로 지금 운영을 하고 있는 평화 관련 사업, 그리고 그걸 어떻게 인도적 지원, 아까 말씀 주셨던 것처럼 파트너십, 인도적 지원과 개발과 평화가 어떻게 연계를 해서 파트너십을 구축해서 이행을 할 수 있는지에 대해서 아주 디테일하게 설명을 해주실 예정이거든요. 그래서 먼저 세 번째 세션을 시작하기 전에 잠깐 휴식 시간을 갖도록 하겠습니다. 지금부터 15분간 약간 휴식을 갖고요. 연회장 밖에 복도에 보시면은 다과가 준비되어 있습니다. 자유롭게 이용하시고 15분 뒤인 오후 3시 40분부터 다시 시작하도록 하겠습니다.